The German shepherd dropped the blood-soaked wallet at Dr. Sarah Mitchell's feet, his amber eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. His scarred muzzle trembled as he backed away 3 precise steps. Military spacing, she realized with growing dread. This wasn't Frank Patterson's morning walk gone wrong. Sarah's coffee mug shattered against the clinic floor as her hands went numb. The leather wallet lay open, revealing not just an ID, but something that shouldn't exist. A government card marked classified in red letters that seemed to pulse in the morning light. The dog's ears flattened against his skull as a helicopter's distant thrum echoed across Pine Valley's hills. 48 hours. That's how long Frank Patterson had been missing, and this scarred veteran, both man and dog, knew something the rest of them didn't. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, her father's war stories suddenly feeling too close, too real. Who had Frank Patterson really been? And why was someone willing to kill to keep it buried? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Valley's main street as Sarah Mitchell knelt beside the German shepherd, her veterinary instincts warring with a growing sense of dread. The dog's coat told a story of survival, patchy fur where malnutrition had taken its toll, scars that spoke of violence, and eyes that held the kind of intelligence that came from military training. She'd seen enough service animals to recognize the signs. "You're not just any stray, are you, soldier?" she whispered, noting how he held himself at attention despite his obvious exhaustion. The dog, she'd started thinking of him as Max after seeing him around town for months, remained perfectly still as she examined the wallet more closely. Frank Patterson, age 67, Vietnam veteran, but tucked behind his driver's license was something that made her blood run cold, a small card bearing official government seals and the word classified, stamped in red ink. Sarah's hands trembled as memories of her father's stories flooded back. Harold Mitchell had served 2 tours in Vietnam, coming home with nightmares and a deep distrust of anything marked classified. He'd died 3 years ago, but not before sharing stories about soldiers who knew too much, about good men who disappeared when they became inconvenient to people in power. Pine Valley was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Population 847, nestled in California's Central Valley between rolling hills dotted with oak trees and cattle ranches. It was a place where the high school football team was front-page news, where the annual Harvest Festival still drew families from 3 counties over, and where a man like Frank Patterson couldn't just disappear without someone noticing. Frank had been a fixture in Pine Valley for over 40 years. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Ruth, right after returning from Vietnam, and they'd built a life together that seemed as solid as the oak trees that lined Main Street. Ruth had died 18 months ago after a brutal battle with cancer, leaving Frank alone in their modest house on Elm Street with medical bills that had consumed their life savings. The town had watched Frank spiral after Ruth's death. The quiet man who'd once coached Little League and volunteered at the Veterans of Foreign Wars post had retreated into himself, finding solace in bottles of whiskey and the dark corners of Murphy's Tavern. But even in his darkest moments, Frank had maintained his dignity. He was a Purple Heart recipient, a man who'd served his country with honor, and Pine Valley took care of its own. Max shifted slightly, drawing Sarah's attention back to the present. The dog's behavior was unlike any stray she'd encountered. His posture, his alertness, the way he'd approached her with purposeful intent, everything about him screamed military training. She'd treated enough retired police and military working dogs to recognize the signs, the controlled aggression, the hypervigilance, the way he scanned his surroundings constantly. As Sarah reached for her phone to call Sheriff Bradley, she noticed something else that made her stomach clench. Max's left ear bore a small, precise notch, not the ragged tear of a street fight, but the clean mark of shrapnel. His right hindquarter showed signs of an old injury, the kind that came from explosive trauma. This dog was a veteran, just like Frank. The pieces began forming a picture she didn't want to see. Frank Patterson, Vietnam veteran with government secrets. Max, a military working dog with combat scars. Both of them discarded by the very system they'd served. Both of them carrying wounds that went deeper than flesh. Sheriff Tom Bradley answered on the second ring. At 54, Bradley had spent his entire career in Pine Valley, watching over a community where the biggest crimes were usually bar fights and cattle rustling. But he was nobody's fool, and 30 years of police work had taught him to trust his instincts. "Tom, it's Sarah Mitchell. I need you to get over to my clinic right away. It's about Frank Patterson." "Sarah, we've got search teams combing every inch of—" "Tom." Her voice cut through his explanation. "A dog just brought me Frank's wallet. There's blood on it, and there's something else. Something that suggests Frank's disappearance isn't what we thought." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. When Bradley spoke again, his voice had taken on the careful tone he used when things were about to get complicated. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't touch anything else, and don't let anyone leave." As Sarah waited for the sheriff, she found herself studying Max more closely. Despite his obvious exhaustion and malnourishment, he remained alert, his amber eyes tracking every sound, every movement. When a car backfired 2 blocks away, he dropped into a defensive crouch that spoke of combat conditioning. When the morning breeze carried the sound of a helicopter passing overhead, probably from the news station covering Frank's disappearance, Max's entire body went rigid with tension. This wasn't just a lost pet or an abandoned animal. This was a soldier, and soldiers didn't abandon their missions. Whatever had happened to Frank Patterson, Max had witnessed it. More than that, Max was trying to help. Sarah's mind raced as she connected the dots. Frank had adopted Max 8 months ago, right after his retirement from military service. The timing hadn't seemed significant then, just a lonely widower taking in a dog that needed a home, but what if it had been something more? What if Frank had known exactly what kind of dog he was adopting? The government card in Frank's wallet suggested secrets, and secrets had a way of catching up with people, especially people who'd served their country long enough to see things they weren't supposed to see, to know things they weren't supposed to know. Max suddenly stood, his ears pricked forward as the sound of Sheriff Bradley's patrol car grew closer. The dog's tail gave a single controlled wag, not the exuberant greeting of a pet, but the acknowledgement of an ally by a professional. Even in his current state, hungry and homeless, Max maintained the bearing of a soldier. As Bradley's patrol car pulled into the clinic's parking lot, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't just going to report a missing person case. She was going to fight for 2 veterans who'd been abandoned by the system they'd served, because if her father had taught her anything, it was that the price of freedom wasn't just paid on battlefields. Sometimes it was paid in the quiet moments when good people decided to stand up for those who'd already given everything. The morning sun climbed higher over Pine Valley, but Sarah Mitchell knew that before this day was over, their peaceful town would be forced to confront truths it wasn't prepared to handle. Sheriff Tom Bradley's boots crunched on the gravel as he stepped out of his patrol car, his weathered face set in the grim expression Sarah had seen too many times over the years. At 54, Bradley had the kind of steady presence that came from 3 decades of small-town policing. But the tension in his shoulders told her this case was already weighing on him differently than the usual missing person reports. Max rose to his feet as Bradley approached, his military bearing unmistakable even in his weakened state. The dog didn't approach or retreat. He simply waited, amber eyes tracking the sheriff's every movement with the calculated assessment of a professional. "That's some dog," Bradley murmured, noting the scars and the way Max held himself. Military working dog? Has to be, Sarah replied, carefully handing over the evidence bag containing Frank's wallet. Look at his conditioning, his behavior. And Sheriff, there's something else you need to see. Bradley's expression darkened as he examined the government card tucked behind Frank's driver's license. He'd seen enough classified documents during his brief stint in the Army Reserve to recognize the real thing. This changes everything, he said quietly. Frank Patterson wasn't just some old drunk who wandered off. The radio on Bradley's belt crackled to life. Sheriff, we've got Deputy Martinez reporting back from the Miller Ranch search. No sign of Patterson, but she found something you're going to want to see. What kind of something? Tire tracks. Fresh ones. Heading toward the old quarry road. And Sheriff, there's broken glass scattered around the barn. Looks like there might have been a struggle. Bradley keyed his radio while studying Max, who had suddenly become agitated at the mention of the quarry road. The dog's ears flattened against his skull, and a low whine escaped his throat, not fear, but recognition. "You know that place, don't you, boy?" Sarah said softly, crouching beside Max. The dog looked at her with eyes that held too much knowledge, too much pain. Whatever had happened to Frank, Max had either witnessed it or understood its significance in ways that chilled her to the bone. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in the passenger seat of Bradley's patrol car, following the winding road toward Pine Valley's eastern hills. Max sat in the back seat, his body tense with anticipation, occasionally letting out soft whimpers that seemed to guide their direction. Every few minutes he would nudge Bradley's shoulder and indicate with subtle body language which way to turn. The old Miller Ranch had been abandoned for 5 years, ever since drought and debt had forced the family to sell their cattle and move to Phoenix. The property sat on 200 acres of scrubland, dotted with oak trees and bisected by a seasonal creek that had been dry for the past 3 summers. It was the perfect place to hide something, or someone, without fear of discovery. Deputy Rosa Martinez met them at the ranch gate, her young face serious with concern. At 28, she was the newest member of Bradley's small force, but her attention to detail had already made her invaluable. "The tire tracks lead right up to the main barn," she reported, falling into step beside them as Max led the way with increasing urgency. "But Sheriff, whoever was here, they knew what they were doing. Tried to cover their tracks, but the recent rain made the ground soft enough to leave impressions." The barn stood like a weathered sentinel against the afternoon sky, its red paint faded to rust and its roof sagging from years of neglect. But as they approached, Sarah could see that someone had been here recently. The weeds around the entrance were trampled, and there were scuff marks in the dirt that suggested heavy objects had been dragged. Max stopped abruptly about 20 feet from the barn entrance, his hackles rising. He began to pace in a tight circle, whining and pawing at the ground with increasing agitation. "He's trying to tell us something," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it happened, isn't it, Max?" Bradley drew his service weapon, motioning for Sarah and Martinez to stay behind him. But as they approached the barn's open doorway, it became clear that whatever had transpired here was over. The interior was empty except for the detritus of abandonment, rusty farm equipment, rotting hay bales, and the accumulated dust of neglect. But there was something else. In the center of the barn floor, barely visible in the filtered sunlight, was a dark stain that made Sarah's stomach clench. Blood, dried and brown, surrounded by fragments of safety glass that glinted like scattered diamonds. "Frank's truck," Bradley said grimly, examining the glass. "Same type of safety glass used in the windshields. Someone smashed it here." Max approached the bloodstain with visible reluctance, his entire body trembling. He sniffed once, then backed away with a whimper that cut straight through Sarah's heart. Whatever had happened to Frank Patterson, his loyal companion had been forced to witness it. Martinez was documenting the scene with her camera when her radio squawked. The dispatcher's voice carried an edge of excitement that made them all freeze. "All units, we just received a call from Jennifer Patterson. She's flying in from San Francisco and offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to her father's safe return. She'll be arriving at the Pine Valley airstrip within the hour." Bradley and Sarah exchanged glances. Frank Patterson's daughter hadn't been in contact with her father since her mother's funeral 18 months ago. Her sudden appearance, complete with a massive reward offer, raised questions that neither of them wanted to voice. But Max's reaction was even more telling. At the mention of Jennifer's name, the dog's ears pricked forward, and his tail gave a single sharp wag, not of joy, but of recognition tinged with something that looked disturbingly like wariness. The Pine Valley airstrip was little more than a single runway carved into a field of dead grass, with a weathered hangar that had seen better decades. But as the sleek Cessna Citation touched down in a cloud of dust and prairie wind, it brought with it the kind of money and influence that Pine Valley rarely saw. Jennifer Patterson stepped out of the aircraft wearing a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than most locals made in a month. At 42, she carried herself with the polished confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder in San Francisco's cutthroat marketing world. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her green eyes, Frank's eyes, swept the small gathering of law enforcement personnel with calculating precision. Sheriff Bradley approached her with the measured courtesy he reserved for outsiders, but Sarah noticed the way Max reacted to Jennifer's presence. The dog's entire body went rigid, his ears flattened against his skull, and he took several steps backward until he was partially hidden behind Sarah's legs. It wasn't fear, it was the cautious assessment of a soldier evaluating a potential threat. "Miss Patterson," Bradley said, extending his hand, "I'm Sheriff Bradley. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." Jennifer's handshake was firm, businesslike. "Sheriff, thank you for everything you're doing. I came as soon as I heard." Her voice carried the slight breathlessness of controlled emotion, but something about her timing nagged at Sarah. Frank had been missing for less than 48 hours, and Jennifer had somehow managed to arrange private air transport, liquidate enough assets to offer a $50,000 reward, and coordinate with media outlets, all while supposedly being shocked by the news of her father's disappearance. "Ma'am, I have to ask," Bradley said carefully, "when was the last time you spoke with your father?" Jennifer's composure flickered for just a moment. "Christmas. We had a difficult relationship after Mom died. I've been trying to get Dad to sell the house, move somewhere with better medical care. He was stubborn about it." She glanced around the airstrip with barely concealed distaste. "This town holds too many memories for him." Sarah watched Max during this exchange, noting how the dog's agitation increased with every word Jennifer spoke. When Jennifer mentioned selling the house, Max let out a low whine that made Sarah's skin crawl. There was recognition in that sound, and it wasn't pleasant. "Ms. Patterson," Sarah said, stepping forward, "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the veterinarian who found your father's wallet. This is Max." She gestured to the German shepherd, who was now watching Jennifer with the focused intensity of a predator. "He belonged to your father." Jennifer's eyes widened as she took in Max's appearance, the scars, the military bearing, the obvious signs of months spent surviving on the streets. "Oh my God, that's the dog Dad adopted. What happened to him? Why does he look like that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt her temper rise at the implication that Frank had somehow neglected Max. But before she could respond, Deputy Martinez's radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, we've got a situation at the Patterson house on Elm Street. Neighbors reported seeing a man in the backyard going through the garbage. When Officer Chen arrived to investigate, the subject fled on foot." Bradley was already moving toward his patrol car. Description: white male, approximately 50 years old, medium build, wearing military surplus clothing. Chen said he looked like he might be homeless. No weapons visible, but he was definitely searching for something specific. Max's reaction to this news was immediate and dramatic. He began pacing in tight circles, whining and pawing at the ground with increasing agitation. When Bradley opened the patrol car door, Max bolted toward the vehicle and jumped into the back seat without invitation. "He knows something," Sarah said, following Max to the car. "Sheriff, I'm coming with you." Jennifer's voice cut through the commotion. "I'm coming too. That's my father's house." The drive to Elm Street took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Max paced restlessly in the back seat, occasionally letting out sharp barks that seemed to indicate urgency. Jennifer sat rigidly beside Sarah, her earlier composure replaced by something that looked like barely controlled panic. Frank Patterson's house sat on a quiet street lined with mature elm trees, their leaves just beginning to turn the gold and amber colors of autumn. It was a modest two-story home with a wraparound porch and the kind of well-maintained yard that spoke of pride in ownership. But as they pulled into the driveway, Sarah could see signs that all was not well. The grass was overgrown, newspapers had accumulated on the front steps, and several windows showed the drawn blinds of a house whose occupant had given up on the outside world. Officer David Chen, a compact man in his 30s, with the alert eyes of someone who took his job seriously, met them at the front gate. "Subject was definitely looking for something specific, Sheriff. He'd already gone through 3 garbage cans and was working on a 4th when I arrived. Took off running toward the creek when he saw my patrol car." Max was out of the car before Bradley had fully stopped, racing toward the backyard with the determination of a bloodhound following a scent. Sarah hurried after him, followed by Bradley and Jennifer, while Chen brought up the rear with his hand resting on his service weapon. The backyard was a mess. Garbage bags had been torn open and their contents scattered across the lawn. But this wasn't random vandalism. Someone had been searching for something specific, going through papers and personal items with methodical precision. Max stopped beside a pile of scattered documents, many of them bearing official government seals. He sat at attention and barked once, sharp and commanding, the kind of alert bark that military working dogs were trained to give when they'd found their target. Sarah knelt beside the papers, her hands trembling as she recognized what she was seeing. Military service records, correspondence with Veterans Administration officials, and most disturbing of all, copies of classified documents that should never have left government custody. "Jennifer," Bradley said carefully, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when he was about to make an arrest, "I need to ask you some questions about your father's military service, and about when you really last spoke to him." Jennifer's face had gone pale, her corporate composure cracking like ice under pressure. "I don't know anything about this," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Dad never talked about the war." Max chose that moment to walk directly to Jennifer and sit at her feet, staring up at her with those intelligent amber eyes. His tail didn't wag. His posture was that of a soldier presenting evidence to a commanding officer. And in that moment, Sarah realized that Max wasn't just trying to find Frank Patterson. He was trying to expose the truth about why Frank had disappeared and who was responsible for it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scattered documents, each page a piece of a puzzle that was growing more dangerous by the hour. Frank Patterson hadn't just been a small-town veteran living quietly with his memories. He'd been a man who knew secrets, and secrets had a way of getting people killed. The interrogation room at the Pine Valley Sheriff's Department had seen its share of petty criminals and domestic disputes, but it had never contained the kind of tension that filled it now. Jennifer Patterson sat across from Sheriff Bradley, her manicured hands folded tightly in her lap, while Max lay in the corner watching her every move with the unblinking focus of a sentry. Sarah had been granted permission to stay, ostensibly to keep Max calm, but really because Bradley valued her judgment about people. And right now, people were proving to be more complicated than anyone had anticipated. "Let's start simple," Bradley said, his voice carrying the patient authority of 3 decades in law enforcement. "When did you really last speak to your father, Jennifer?" Jennifer's green eyes darted between Bradley and Max before settling on her hands. "I told you. Christmas. That was 10 months ago," Sarah interjected softly. 10 months, and you never called to check on a grieving widower with diabetes who was struggling with alcohol? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Jennifer's composure cracked further, and for the first time since stepping off that private jet, she looked like what she really was, a frightened woman trying to juggle too many lies. "You don't understand," Jennifer said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "Dad changed after Mom died. He became difficult, paranoid. He started talking about conspiracies, about people watching the house. I thought it was just grief and whiskey making him imagine things." Max lifted his head at the word watching, his ears pricking forward. The dog had been unusually calm during the interrogation, but something in Jennifer's tone seemed to trigger a memory. He rose to his feet and padded over to the table, sitting directly beside Bradley's chair in a gesture that was clearly protective. "But you didn't think his paranoia was worth investigating when you offered that $50,000 reward," Bradley observed. "That's a lot of money to liquidate on short notice, Jennifer, especially for someone you hadn't spoken to in 10 months. Jennifer's face flushed red. "He's my father. Despite our problems, I love him. When I heard he was missing—" "How did you hear?" Sarah interrupted. "The story didn't hit the news wires until this morning. You were already in the air by then." The question struck home like a physical blow. Jennifer's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, her carefully constructed story collapsing under scrutiny. In the silence, Max let out a low whine that sounded almost like disappointment. Deputy Martinez chose that moment to knock on the interrogation room door. Bradley stepped outside for a hushed conversation that lasted several minutes, leaving Jennifer alone with Sarah and Max. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Well, you know what happened to him," Sarah said quietly. "Max can sense it. Dogs don't lie the way people do." Jennifer looked at the German shepherd, who had moved closer to her chair. Despite his obvious wariness, Max seemed to be studying her with something that might have been sympathy. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," she whispered. "I just wanted Dad to be safe." Before Sarah could respond, Bradley returned with an expression that suggested the case had just taken another dark turn. "Jennifer, we need to talk about your father's military service. Specifically, about a staff sergeant, Robert Chen, who died in Afghanistan 6 years ago." Max's reaction was immediate and dramatic. At the mention of Robert Chen's name, the dog began to pace frantically, whining and pawing at the air as if trying to catch something invisible. His distress was so acute that Sarah instinctively moved to comfort him, but Max shied away from her touch for the first time since they'd met. "Bobby Chen was Max's handler," Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad told me about him, about how he died." "According to military records," Bradley continued, consulting a file that Martinez had brought him, "Robert Chen and his K-9 partner Max were killed in an IED explosion while investigating suspected weapons smuggling. But Max survived, obviously, which makes me wonder what else about that official report might be incomplete." Jennifer's composure finally shattered completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. Dad never got over what happened in Afghanistan. Not the explosion, not Bobby's death, not what they made him do afterward. "What did they make him do, Jennifer?" "Cover it up." Her voice was muffled by her hands, but the words were clear enough to chill everyone in the room. Dad was Bobby's mentor, his training supervisor. When Bobby started asking questions about where certain weapons shipments were going, People noticed. Important people. Sarah felt her blood run cold. The explosion wasn't an accident. Dad thinks Bobby was murdered, eliminated because he'd stumbled onto something that went all the way to the top. And Max— Jennifer looked at the dog, who had stopped pacing and was now sitting at attention as if waiting for orders. Max was supposed to die too, but he survived, and he saw everything. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place now, forming a picture that none of them wanted to see clearly. Max wasn't just a traumatized war veteran. He was a witness to murder. And Frank Patterson wasn't just a grieving widower drowning his sorrows in whiskey. He was a man carrying the burden of knowledge that powerful people would kill to protect. "Someone's been pressuring you," Bradley said. It wasn't a question. "Someone contacted you about your father." Jennifer nodded miserably. 3 weeks ago, a man called me at work. He knew things about Dad's military record, about his finances, about the medical bills from Mom's cancer. He said Dad was in danger, that there were people who wanted to clean up loose ends from the Afghanistan operation. "And he offered you a deal," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "Help them get to Frank, and they'd make sure you inherited the house free and clear." "I never thought they would actually hurt him." Jennifer's voice rose to a near shriek. "They said they just wanted to talk to him, to make sure he understood the importance of keeping certain things quiet. They said Max was the real problem, that as long as the dog was alive, there was always a risk that someone would piece together what really happened." Max stood up and walked directly to Jennifer, placing his massive head on her knee in a gesture that was unmistakably forgiving. Despite everything, the betrayal, the danger, the months of abandonment, the dog still recognized her as Frank's daughter, still offered comfort to someone in pain. Bradley's radio crackled to life, interrupting the confession. "Sheriff, we've got an update on that homeless subject who was searching through the Patterson garbage. Officer Chen tracked him down near the creek. His name is Thomas Morrison, former Marine, 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's asking to speak with someone about Frank Patterson." The name hit Jennifer like a physical blow. Tommy Morrison. Oh God, Dad mentioned him. He was part of Bobby Chen's unit. Max's ears shot forward at the name, and he began to pace again, but this time with excitement rather than distress. His tail wagged once, the first genuinely happy expression they'd seen from him since this whole nightmare began. "He's alive," Jennifer breathed. Dad always wondered what happened to the other members of Bobby's team. "He tried to track them down, but the military said most of them had died or disappeared." Bradley was already moving toward the door. "Martinez, have Chen bring Morrison in, and get me everything you can find on the other members of Chen's unit. I want to know who's still alive and who might be in danger." As the sheriff prepared to leave, Sarah caught his arm. "Tom, there's something else. If Jennifer's right about this being a cover-up, then we're not just dealing with 1 or 2 rogue agents. We're talking about people with resources, connections, the ability to make problems disappear permanently." "You think they'll come after the witnesses?" Bradley said grimly. "I think they already have. Frank's disappearance wasn't random, and it wasn't amateur hour. Someone with training and equipment took him. Someone who knew his routines, his weaknesses, his connections." Max had been listening to their conversation with the focused attention of someone who understood far more than he could communicate. Suddenly, he trotted to the interrogation room door and began scratching at it urgently, whining and looking back at them with clear intent. "He wants to go somewhere," Sarah said. "Max, what is it? Do you know where Frank is?" The dog's response was immediate. He sat at attention, barked once, and then moved to Jennifer's chair. He sat beside her and placed one paw on her arm, looking directly into her eyes with an intensity that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "He's trying to tell us something about Jennifer," Bradley said slowly. "Something about her connection to all this." Jennifer's face went white. The phone call. The man who contacted me. He said he'd be in touch, that I needed to stay available for further instructions. He said. She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. What did he say, Jennifer? He said that if anything went wrong, if Dad tried to run or contact anyone, they'd know, because they'd be watching through me. She fumbled in her purse and pulled out her cell phone with trembling hands. He gave me this. Said it was secure, that I should use it instead of my regular phone. Oh, God, they've been tracking everything. Every call, every text, every... Max's barking suddenly became frantic, his head swiveling toward the window. Outside, the sound of vehicles approaching fast could be heard over his urgent warnings. Not the lazy rumble of Pine Valley's usual traffic, but the high-performance engines of cars designed for speed and pursuit. Bradley drew his weapon and moved to the window. What he saw made his face go grim with understanding. 3 black SUVs with government plates were pulling into the sheriff's department parking lot, and men in dark suits were already getting out, their movements coordinated and professional. They found us, Jennifer whispered. Dear God, they found us. Max positioned himself between Jennifer and the door, his hackles raised and his body tense for combat. Whatever was coming through that door, the old soldier was ready to fight one more battle. But this time he wasn't fighting for his country or his handler. He was fighting for the family he'd chosen, for the people who'd shown him loyalty when the world had forgotten his sacrifice. Outside, car doors slammed with the finality of a coffin closing. Time was running out, and the real battle for Frank Patterson's life and the truth about what happened in Afghanistan was about to begin. The lead agent who walked through the sheriff's department door carried himself with the kind of authority that came from decades of making problems disappear. Special Agent Marcus Webb was tall, silver-haired, and wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most Pine Valley residents made in a month. His steel-gray eyes swept the room with calculating precision, taking in every detail, every potential threat, every escape route. Sheriff Bradley, Webb said, his voice carrying the flat, professional tone of someone who delivered bad news to families and made inconvenient witnesses understand the value of silence. I'm Agent Webb, Department of Defense Intelligence. We need to discuss Frank Patterson. Max's reaction to Webb's presence was immediate and visceral. The German shepherd's hackles rose like a ridge of black and tan spears, and a growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Not the warning growl of a domestic dog protecting territory, but the battle-ready snarl of a combat veteran recognizing mortal danger. Bradley kept his hand near his weapon, his 30 years of police experience screaming warnings about men who showed up unannounced with federal credentials and dead eyes. Agent Webb, this is an active missing person investigation. Unless you have information about Frank Patterson's whereabouts, I'm going to have to ask you to... Sheriff, Webb interrupted, his tone carrying the kind of finality that suggested arguing would be both pointless and dangerous. Frank Patterson is no longer missing. He's been located and is currently in federal custody for his own protection. This matter is now classified under the National Defense Authorization Act. The silence that followed Webb's announcement was broken only by Max's increasingly agitated pacing. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the implications sank in. If Frank was in federal custody, it meant either he was safe or he was dead, and they were covering it up. I want to see him, Jennifer said, finding her voice for the first time since the agents had arrived. I want proof that my father is alive and safe. Webb's smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. Ms. Patterson, your father is receiving the best possible care. However, due to the sensitive nature of the information he possesses, visitation is restricted. I'm sure you understand. Actually, I don't understand, Sarah interjected, moving to stand beside Max, whose protective instincts had positioned him between the agents and Jennifer. I don't understand how a missing person case becomes a federal matter. I don't understand how a man disappears from his hometown and ends up in federal custody without any legal process, and I don't understand why you're so interested in a retired veterinarian and a stray dog. Webb's attention shifted to Sarah with the focused intensity of a predator sizing up prey. Dr. Mitchell, isn't it? Your father served in Vietnam, Operation Phoenix. He understood the necessity of compartmentalization, of keeping certain truths classified for the greater good. The mention of her father hit Sarah like a physical blow. Harold Mitchell had indeed served in Vietnam, and he'd carried secrets to his grave that still haunted her. But she'd learned from his example that some secrets were worth keeping, and others were worth exposing, regardless of the cost. My father also taught me that honor means protecting those who can't protect themselves, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. And right now, I'm looking at a dog who's been abandoned by the system he served, and a family that's been lied to by people who are supposed to protect them. Max chose that moment to step forward, positioning himself directly between Webb and the others. The dog's military bearing was unmistakable as he sat at attention, but his message was clear. You'll have to go through me first. Webb's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time, Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been respect. That's quite a dog, Dr. Mitchell. Military Working Dog Program, if I'm not mistaken. Specialized training in explosive detection and enemy identification. He paused, studying Max's scars with professional interest. Afghanistan Deployment 2018. Handler was Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, killed in an IED explosion, along with several other members of his unit. You know what really happened? Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. You know Bobby Chen was murdered. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Webb's casual demeanor evaporated, replaced by something cold and dangerous. Miss Patterson, I think you've been listening to too many of your father's war stories. Combat zones are chaotic places. Sometimes good soldiers die in bad circumstances. And sometimes good soldiers witness things they're not supposed to witness, Bradley said, his hand now resting openly on his service weapon. Agent Webb, I'm going to need to see some identification and a warrant before this conversation goes any further. Webb reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, producing credentials that looked official enough to be real. But Sarah had spent enough time around government bureaucracy during her father's VA claims to recognize when something felt wrong. The timing, the resources, the immediate response to what should have been a local missing person case, it all pointed to a cover-up that went far beyond one dead soldier and his dog. Sheriff, Webb said, his voice taking on a more conciliatory tone, I understand your concern for Mr. Patterson's welfare, but this situation involves matters of national security that go far beyond your jurisdiction. The best thing for everyone, including Frank, is to let us handle this quietly. Max's growl intensified at Webb's words, and Sarah realized the dog was reacting not just to the agent's presence, but to his voice. Recognition flickered in Max's amber eyes, and his body language shifted from protective to predatory. You were there, Sarah said, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. In Afghanistan, Max recognizes your voice. Webb's carefully controlled expression cracked for just a moment, revealing something like admiration. Dr. Mitchell, you're very perceptive. Yes, I was there. I was conducting an investigation into weapons trafficking when Sergeant Chen stumbled into something he didn't understand. He understood enough, Jennifer said, tears streaming down her face. He understood that American weapons were being sold to the highest bidder, and he was going to expose it. And you killed him for it. Sarah added, her voice flat with disgust. "You killed a good soldier and his entire unit to protect your operation." Webb's smile returned, but it was the expression of a shark that had decided to stop pretending to be a dolphin. "Dr. Mitchell, you have quite an imagination, but imagination and proof are very different things. The only witness to what happened in that compound was a dog, and dogs can't testify in court." Max stood up slowly, his entire body vibrating with controlled rage. The old soldier had heard enough. With movements that were faster than anyone in the room would have thought possible, Max launched himself at Webb. 70 pounds of military-trained fury aimed at the throat of the man who had murdered his handler. Webb barely managed to get his arm up in time, taking Max's attack on his forearm instead of his neck. The impact sent both of them crashing into the wall, but Max held on with the tenacity of a dog who had finally found his target after 6 years of waiting. "Get him off!" Webb shouted, his professional composure completely shattered as he struggled against Max's grip. "Get this animal off me!" But Bradley, Sarah, and even Jennifer made no move to intervene. They watched as Max, the forgotten veteran, the abandoned soldier, the witness to murder, finally had his chance at justice. It was Deputy Martinez who ended the confrontation, not by helping Webb, but by drawing her weapon and pointing it at the other agents who had started to reach for their own guns. "Everybody just calm down," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Let's all take a step back and think about what's really happening here." Webb finally managed to extract his arm from Max's jaws, blood seeping through his torn sleeve. The dog backed away but remained at attention, ready to attack again if necessary. His message had been delivered with perfect clarity. "I remember you. I've been waiting for you. And this isn't over." "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Webb snarled, cradling his injured arm. "This goes all the way to the top. People will die if this information gets out." "People have already died," Sarah replied, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Good people. People who served their country with honor and were murdered for their loyalty." Webb looked at each of them in turn. Bradley with his hand on his gun, Martinez with her weapon trained on federal agents, Jennifer with her tear-streaked face full of newfound determination, and Sarah with Max at her side like a four-legged embodiment of justice, delayed but not denied. "This isn't over," Webb said finally, his professional mask sliding back into place despite the blood on his sleeve. "Frank Patterson is in federal custody, and that's where he's going to stay. This dog is a national security risk, and arrangements will be made for his disposal. And all of you," his gaze swept the room with deadly promise, "all of you are now involved in matters that could be considered treason." But as Webb and his agents prepared to leave, Max did something that stopped them in their tracks. The German Shepherd walked to the window and barked once, sharp, commanding, unmistakable. It was the alert bark of a military working dog signaling that he had found his target. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard. But these weren't more government SUVs. These were news vans from 3 different television stations, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky like modern-day signal fires. Someone had tipped off the media, and Pine Valley's quiet little secret was about to become national news. Webb's face went ashen as he realized what was happening. A cover-up that had worked for 6 years was about to be exposed by a dog, a veterinarian, a small-town sheriff, and a daughter who had finally chosen loyalty over fear. Max looked at Webb one more time, his amber eyes holding a promise that chilled the federal agent to the bone. The old soldier had found his enemy, and he wasn't going to let him escape again. Not this time. Not when Frank Patterson's life hung in the balance, and the truth about Bobby Chen's murder was finally within reach. The battle for Pine Valley had begun, and Max intended to win it. The underground bunker beneath the abandoned military facility was a relic from the Cold War, built to withstand nuclear attack but now serving as the perfect prison for inconvenient witnesses. Frank Patterson sat tied to a metal chair in the center of the concrete room, his wrists raw from rope burns and his face gaunt from 3 days without proper food or water. The single bulb hanging from a frayed wire cast harsh shadows that made the room feel like a tomb. But Frank wasn't alone. In the corner, barely visible in the dim light, sat another figure. A man whose hollow eyes and trembling hands spoke of months of captivity. Thomas "Tommy" Morrison, former Marine and the last surviving member of Bobby Chen's unit, looked up as Frank stirred. "You awake, Sarge?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse and despair. At 49, he looked 20 years older, his body wasted by malnutrition and his mind fractured by trauma that went far beyond combat stress. Frank tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Tommy understood and used his bound hands to push a small cup of water across the floor. Their captor's daily ration, barely enough to keep them alive, but not enough to give them strength. "How long?" Frank managed after taking a sip. "For you? 3 days? For me?" Tommy's laugh was bitter and broken. 8 months, ever since I tried to contact that reporter in Sacramento about what really happened to Bobby. The truth hit Frank like a physical blow. Tommy Morrison hadn't disappeared into homelessness and mental illness. He'd been disappeared, taken by the same people who had now come for Frank. The elaborate cover story, the reports of PTSD and violent episodes, the family's abandonment, it had all been orchestrated to explain away his disappearance. "They killed the others," Tommy continued, his voice flat with the kind of emotional numbness that comes from witnessing too much horror. "Martinez, Johnson, Williams, all the guys who were with us that night when Bobby found the weapons cache, made it look like accidents, suicides, overdoses. I'm the only one left, and now you." Frank's mind reeled as he processed the implications. Bobby Chen's entire unit, 8 good soldiers, had been systematically eliminated to protect a weapons trafficking operation that reached into the highest levels of the military and intelligence communities. And Max, the loyal dog who had witnessed it all, had been meant to die with them. "The dog," Frank said suddenly. "Max, they wanted him dead too." Tommy's eyes widened with something like hope. "Max is alive? That beautiful, stubborn son of a bitch is still alive?" "Not just alive," Frank said, feeling a surge of pride despite their desperate circumstances. "Still fighting, still serving. He's the one who found me, Tommy. He's been trying to save us both." The heavy metal door at the top of the stairs creaked open, interrupting their conversation. Agent Webb descended into the bunker, his expensive suit replaced by tactical gear and his wounded arm in a sling, a souvenir from his encounter with Max. Behind him came 2 other men, both carrying military-grade weapons and the dead-eyed expression of professional killers. "Gentlemen," Webb said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls, "I'm afraid your rescue committee has become a bit too persistent for comfort. We have reporters sniffing around, federal investigators asking questions, and a very troublesome dog who seems determined to expose our operation." Frank tried to struggle against his bonds, but 3 days of captivity had left him weak. "If you hurt that dog—" "Oh, Mr. Patterson, we're well past the point of making threats." Webb pulled out a tablet and showed them a video feed from the Pine Valley Sheriff's Department. Frank's heart clenched as he saw Max pacing frantically in the corner of what looked like an interrogation room, Sarah Mitchell trying to calm him while Sheriff Bradley argued with federal agents. "Your canine friend has become quite the local celebrity," Webb continued. "The news crews are calling him a hero. Social media is trending with hashtags about abandoned veterans and government cover-ups. Very inconvenient for our ongoing operations." Tommy raised his head with effort. "You can't kill us all, Webb. Too many people know now." The story's too big to contain. Webb's smile was the expression of a man who had been killing inconvenient people for decades. Mr. Morrison, you'd be surprised how effectively a tragic accident can end even the most persistent investigation. A gas leak in this old facility, an explosion that kills 3 unstable veterans who had broken in looking for shelter. Very sad, very final, very believable. The smell of gas began to fill the bunker as one of Webb's men turned a valve on an old heating system. Frank realized with growing horror that they weren't planning to shoot them. They were planning to stage an accident that would eliminate the witnesses and destroy any evidence of their captivity. "You have maybe 10 minutes before the gas reaches a dangerous concentration," Webb said, backing toward the stairs. "I suggest you spend that time making peace with whatever gods you worship. And don't worry about Max. We'll make sure his death is quick. Professional courtesy, one soldier to another." As the metal door clanged shut, Frank heard the distinctive sound of multiple locks engaging. They were trapped in a concrete tomb with poison gas slowly filling the air, while somewhere above them the people they loved were walking into the same trap. But as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Frank remembered something Tommy had said earlier. Max was still fighting, still serving. The old soldier hadn't given up, and neither would they. "Tommy," Frank said, his voice gaining strength despite the gas burning his lungs. "Tell me about the night Bobby died. Tell me everything Max saw. If we're going to die down here, at least someone should know the whole truth." Tommy's eyes focused with an intensity that had been absent moments before. The chance to finally tell the story, to honor his fallen comrades, gave him purpose even in the face of death. And somewhere above them, as if sensing their desperate need, Max began to bark with the urgent rhythm of a dog who had found his target and would not be denied justice. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the Pine Valley Sheriff's Department as Max hurled himself against the interrogation room door with the desperate fury of a soldier who knew his brothers in arms were dying. Sarah pressed her hands against the reinforced glass, watching helplessly as the German shepherd's claws scraped deep gouges in the metal frame, his barks becoming increasingly frantic with each passing second. "He knows," she said, turning to Sheriff Bradley, who was coordinating with the news crews gathered outside. "Tom, Max knows where Frank is, and he knows they're running out of time." Bradley looked up from his radio, his weathered face grim with the realization that they were fighting a battle they might already have lost. "The federal marshals Webb called in are blocking every road out of town. They've got jurisdiction, Sarah." "My hands are tied." "Then untie them," Jennifer Patterson said from her corner of the room, where she'd been making phone calls with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd finally found her backbone. "I just got off the phone with Senator Morrison's office, no relation to Tommy, but his chief of staff is very interested in a story about murdered soldiers and covered-up weapons trafficking." Max's barking suddenly changed pitch, becoming the rapid-fire alert signal of a military working dog who had located explosives. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the warning. During her father's final years, when his PTSD nightmares had been at their worst, he'd described that exact sound. The bark that meant death was seconds away. "Gas," Sarah breathed, understanding flooding through her with horrible clarity. "He's smelling gas." "They're not just holding Frank prisoner, they're going to kill him and make it look like an accident." Deputy Martinez burst through the door at that moment, her young face flushed with exertion and determination. "Sheriff, I've been monitoring federal communications like you asked. There's chatter about a cleanup operation at the old Riverside Military Depot. Something about eliminating loose ends before the media investigation gains traction." The Riverside Military Depot had been abandoned for 15 years. Its underground facilities sealed after environmental concerns about chemical contamination. It was the perfect place to dispose of inconvenient witnesses, isolated, dangerous, and with a built-in excuse for any bodies that might be discovered later. Max's behavior became even more agitated at the mention of Riverside. He began spinning in tight circles, a behavior Sarah recognized from her work with traumatized animals. It wasn't just anxiety, it was recognition. The dog had been there before. "That's where it happened," Jennifer said suddenly, pieces of her father's fragmented stories finally clicking into place. "Dad mentioned Riverside once when he was drinking heavily. Said it was where they brought Bobby's body after the explosion, where they debriefed the survivors. Max would remember that place." Sheriff Bradley made a decision that would either save lives or end his career. "Martinez, get on the radio to County Sheriff Davidson. Tell him we have credible intelligence about an imminent threat to civilian lives at Riverside. Sarah, can you get Max calm enough to guide us there?" But Max was already moving. The moment Sarah opened the interrogation room door, the German Shepherd bolted toward the exit with the focused determination of a soldier returning to a battlefield he'd never wanted to see again. He paused at the threshold, looking back at them with eyes that held both terror and resolve. The drive to Riverside took 25 minutes that felt like hours. Max rode in the front seat of Bradley's patrol car, his body tense with anticipation, occasionally letting out low whines that seemed to count down the seconds until disaster. Behind them, Martinez followed in a second vehicle with Jennifer and a news crew that had insisted on documenting what might be the biggest story to hit Pine Valley in decades. The Riverside Military Depot sprawled across 200 acres of scrubland, its chain-link fences topped with razor wire that had been rusting for more than a decade. Warning signs about contaminated soil and dangerous structures dotted the perimeter, but Sarah could see tire tracks in the dust, recent ones leading toward a concrete structure that looked like it could withstand a direct nuclear strike. Max was out of the car before it fully stopped, racing toward the bunker entrance with his nose to the ground. His behavior had shifted from frantic to methodical. This was a working dog executing a search and rescue mission, following a scent trail that would lead him to his target or his death. The metal door at the bunker's entrance had been secured with multiple locks, but Sarah could hear the faint sound of voices echoing from below. More importantly, she could smell what had driven Max to near madness. The distinct odor of natural gas, building to dangerous levels in the confined space. "Frank!" Bradley shouted down the ventilation shaft. "Frank Patterson, can you hear me?" The response was weak, but unmistakable. "Here, Tommy's here too. Gas. They're trying to make it look like accident." Jennifer pushed past the sheriff, pressing her face to the ventilation grate. "Dad! Daddy, we're going to get you out. Just hold on." Max had found something else, a second entrance, partially concealed by years of accumulated debris. It was too small for a human but perfectly sized for a military working dog who'd been trained to navigate collapsed buildings and underground tunnels. Without hesitation, Max squeezed through the gap and disappeared into the darkness below. "No!" Sarah called after him, but it was too late. The dog was committed to his mission, just as he'd been 6 years ago in Afghanistan when he'd tried to save Bobby Chen from a bomb that was meant to silence them all. Inside the bunker, Frank Patterson heard the familiar sound of claws on concrete and felt his heart surge with emotion that was half hope, half terror. Max emerged from a crack in the wall like a ghost from the past, his amber eyes scanning the room with tactical precision. "Max, boy," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible over the hiss of escaping gas. "You shouldn't have come. It's too dangerous." But Max was already working. The dog had been trained for exactly this scenario, extracting wounded soldiers from compromised structures. He moved to Frank's chair first, his powerful jaws gripping the rope bindings and working them loose with the patience of a professional. Tommy Morrison watched in amazement as years of military conditioning took over. "He remembers his training," Tommy said, his voice gaining strength for the first time in months. He's going to get us out of here." Above them, the sound of power tools echoed through the bunker as Bradley and his team worked to cut through the locks. But Sarah knew they were running out of time. The gas concentration was approaching explosive levels, and any spark, from the cutting tools, from electrical equipment, even from static electricity, could turn the underground chamber into a crematorium. Max had freed Frank and was working on Tommy's bonds when the lights flickered. The old electrical system, corroded by years of neglect and now compromised by gas exposure, was beginning to fail. In minutes, maybe seconds, a short circuit would provide the ignition source that Webb had planned all along. Frank struggled to his feet, his legs weak from days of captivity, but his spirit strengthened by the presence of the loyal companion who had never stopped fighting for him. "Come on, Tommy. Max found a way in. He can find a way out." Max led them toward the crack in the wall, but it quickly became apparent that while the opening was large enough for the dog, it wouldn't accommodate two full-grown men weakened by captivity. They were trapped, the gas levels rising by the second, the electrical system on the verge of catastrophic failure. That's when Max made a decision that embodied everything Sarah had come to understand about loyalty and sacrifice. Instead of trying to lead them through the crack, the German Shepherd positioned himself between the two men and began barking with the rhythmic intensity of a military working dog calling for backup. The sound carried through the ventilation system with perfect clarity, reaching the ears of every person working frantically above. It was a sound that spoke of training, of discipline, of a soldier who would never abandon his mission. And somewhere in the darkness above them, Sarah Mitchell heard that bark and understood its message. We're here, we're alive, and we're not giving up. The battle for Pine Valley was reaching its climax, and an old soldier with 4 legs was calling in the cavalry one last time. The explosion that rocked the Riverside Military Depot wasn't the catastrophic blast that Agent Webb had orchestrated, but the controlled detonation of Sheriff Bradley's tactical team breaching the bunker's reinforced door. The sound echoed across the valley like thunder, sending up a plume of concrete dust and decades of accumulated debris. But in the seconds before the breach, Max had done something that would be remembered in Pine Valley for generations to come. Using his body as a shield, the German Shepherd had positioned himself over the electrical junction box where sparks were beginning to arc through the gas-laden air. When the inevitable short circuit occurred, Max absorbed the electrical shock that would have ignited the gas, his military conditioning overriding every instinct for self-preservation. The current coursed through his body as he collapsed, twitching and convulsing, but the explosion he prevented by sacrificing himself saved the lives of Frank Patterson and Tommy Morrison. Sarah was the first person through the breached door, her veterinary training taking over as she dropped to her knees beside Max's motionless form. The dog's breathing was shallow and irregular, his amber eyes unfocused but still aware. She could feel the electrical burns beneath his fur, could see the way his muscles spasmed from nerve damage, could smell the acrid scent of burned tissue that told her how close they'd come to losing him. "Frank!" Jennifer's voice echoed through the bunker as she rushed to embrace her father, tears streaming down her face as she took in his gaunt appearance and trembling hands. "Oh God, Daddy, what did they do to you?" But Frank Patterson's attention was fixed on the dog who had saved his life. With strength that surprised everyone, including himself, he crawled across the concrete floor to where Max lay, struggling to breathe. "Max, boy," he whispered, his calloused hands gentle as they stroked the German Shepherd's scarred head. "You came back for me. After everything I did to you, you came back." Tommy Morrison, freed from his 8-month captivity, stood on unsteady legs and looked around the bunker with the wide-eyed amazement of someone seeing sunlight for the first time in forever. "He saved us all," he said. his voice hoarse with emotion. "That dog saved us all, just like he tried to save Bobby 6 years ago." Deputy Martinez was coordinating with the paramedics and veterinary emergency team that had rushed to the scene. But Sarah knew that Max's injuries were beyond anything that could be treated in the field. The electrical shock had caused extensive internal damage, and the stress of months as a stray, followed by the trauma of the rescue, had pushed his body beyond its limits. "We need to get him to the University Veterinary Hospital in Sacramento," Sarah said, her professional composure barely masking her desperation. "If we move fast, if we can get him on life support." But even as she spoke, she could see Max's breathing becoming more labored. The old soldier was dying, his mission finally complete, but his body unable to sustain the effort any longer. His amber eyes found Frank's face, and in that moment, Sarah witnessed something that would haunt her dreams and inspire her waking hours for the rest of her life. Max lifted his head just enough to lick Frank's hand once, a gesture of forgiveness, of love, of the kind of loyalty that transcends species and circumstances. It was the goodbye of a soldier to his brother in arms, the final salute of a dog who had never stopped serving despite being abandoned by the system he'd sworn to protect. Frank felt his heart breaking as he realized what Max was trying to tell him. "No, boy," he whispered, his voice cracking with grief. "Don't give up. Not now. We're going home, Max. We're going home. Together." But Max's eyes were already growing dim. The electrical shock that had saved their lives was claiming his own, his great heart finally giving out after years of trauma and months of survival against impossible odds. His tail gave one last weak wag as he looked at the faces gathered around him. Frank, whom he'd rescued. Jennifer, whom he'd protected. Sarah, who'd shown him kindness. Tommy, his fellow survivor of Afghanistan. When the end came, it was peaceful. Max simply closed his eyes and let go, his breathing stopping as naturally as a sunset fading into night. The bunker fell silent, except for the sound of grown men weeping for a dog who had shown them what true loyalty meant. Outside the bunker, Agent Webb and his team were being taken into custody by FBI agents from the Sacramento field office. The investigation that Jennifer's phone calls had triggered was moving with the speed and efficiency of a federal task force that had been waiting for exactly this kind of break in a case that had frustrated them for years. Webb's weapons trafficking operation, which had cost the lives of 8 soldiers and countless Afghan civilians, was finally being exposed. But Frank Patterson didn't care about justice or vindication or congressional investigations. All he cared about was the still form of the dog who had forgiven him for the unforgivable, who had chosen loyalty over abandonment, who had died protecting the man who had once driven him 20 miles out of town and left him to survive or perish alone. Sarah worked frantically over Max's body, trying every technique she knew to restart his heart, to bring back the spark of life that had burned so brightly despite every attempt to extinguish it. But some injuries go too deep to heal. Some sacrifices are too great to survive. As the sun set over Pine Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded everyone present of the colors in Max's coat, they carried his body out of the bunker with the honor due a fallen soldier. Tommy Morrison, despite his own weakened condition, helped Frank bear the weight of their 4-legged savior, both men understanding that they were carrying more than just a dog. They were carrying the embodiment of everything they'd fought for and everything they'd lost. The news crews that had gathered to document the rescue captured images that would appear on front pages across the country. 2 broken veterans carrying their fallen comrade while a grief-stricken daughter and a small-town veterinarian followed behind. All of them united in their love for a dog who had never stopped believing in the possibility of redemption. Max was gone, but his legacy was just beginning. 6 months after Max's funeral, Pine Valley had changed in ways both visible and profound. The small town that had once been defined by its quiet anonymity now found itself at the center of a national conversation about how America treats its veterans, both human and canine. The congressional hearings sparked by Agent Webb's arrest had led to sweeping reforms in military working dog retirement programs, increased funding for veteran mental health services, and the establishment of the Robert Chen Memorial Foundation for Abandoned Military Animals. But for Frank Patterson, the most important changes were personal and private. The modest house on Elm Street had been restored to its former warmth, with fresh paint on the shutters and flowers blooming in the garden that Ruth had once tended. The medical bills that had driven him to despair were paid off through the settlement from his wrongful imprisonment lawsuit, and the government pension he'd thought was lost forever had been restored with full back pay and benefits. More importantly, Frank had found his purpose again. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, the living room that had once echoed with the silence of grief now filled with the voices of other veterans struggling with their own battles against depression, addiction, and the invisible wounds of war. The Pine Valley Veteran Support Group had started with just Frank and Tommy Morrison, but word had spread quickly through the community of forgotten soldiers who needed someone to remind them that their service mattered. And Tommy had made remarkable progress in his recovery, aided by proper medical care and the knowledge that his 8-month ordeal had finally brought justice for Bobby Chen and his fallen unit. The nightmares still came, but they were tempered by the satisfaction of knowing that Agent Webb and his conspirators were serving life sentences in federal prison. More than that, Tommy had found peace in helping other veterans navigate the bureaucratic maze that had once seemed designed to defeat them. Jennifer had surprised everyone, most of all herself, by leaving her high-powered marketing job in San Francisco and moving back to Pine Valley permanently. She'd opened a small law practice specializing in veterans affairs and victim advocacy, working primarily with families who had been failed by the system their loved ones had served. The relationship with her father, damaged by years of mutual grief and misunderstanding, had been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and shared purpose. But it was Sarah Mitchell who had undergone the most profound transformation. The veterinarian who had once treated animals as her primary calling had discovered that her true gift lay in healing the bonds between humans and the creatures they loved. The second chance. Animal sanctuary she'd established on the outskirts of town had become a national model for rehabilitating military working dogs and matching them with veterans who needed the healing that only unconditional loyalty could provide. The sanctuary's first permanent resident had been a German shepherd named Duke, a bomb detection dog who'd lost his handler in Syria and had been scheduled for euthanasia due to severe PTSD. Sarah had driven 16 hours to the military facility where Duke was being held, remembering Max's final moments and knowing that no soldier should die alone and forgotten. Duke had been placed with Robert Martinez, a Vietnam veteran whose own struggles with nightmares and isolation had nearly cost him his marriage. The pairing had been transformative for both man and dog. Duke found new purpose in providing emotional support, while Robert discovered that healing could come through caring for another wounded soul. On this particular Thursday evening, the support group meeting was special. Frank stood before a room filled with 23 veterans and their families, preparing to dedicate a memorial that had been installed in the town square earlier that day. The bronze statue depicted a German shepherd in military working dog gear sitting at attention beside a pair of empty combat boots. The inscription read, "In memory of Max, Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, and all those who served with honor and died with dignity. Their loyalty survives death itself." "Max taught me something I'd forgotten during my darkest days," Frank said, his voice steady and strong in a way it hadn't been for years. "He taught me that love isn't something you earn through perfection. It's something you choose to give despite imperfection. I abandoned him when he needed me most, and he saved my life anyway, not because I deserved it, but because that's who he was. The room was silent except for the soft sound of tissues being passed around. These were men and women who understood sacrifice, who knew the weight of survivors' guilt and the crushing burden of carrying secrets that could never be shared with civilians who hadn't walked in their boots. "We're here tonight because we all know what it's like to be forgotten," Frank continued, "to serve with everything we had, only to come home to a country that had moved on without us. But Max showed me that being forgotten by the world doesn't mean we have to forget ourselves or each other." Tommy Morrison stood up slowly, his frame still thin from his months of captivity, but his eyes clear and focused in a way they hadn't been since Afghanistan. "I'd like to say something, if that's okay," he said. Frank nodded, stepping aside to give his friend the floor. "For 6 years, I carried the weight of watching good men die for lies told by powerful people," Tommy said. "I thought the only way to honor their memory was to hide, to disappear, to become another casualty of a war that officially ended years ago. But Max showed us all that honor isn't about hiding from the truth, it's about fighting for it, even when the fight costs everything you have." The meeting ended, as it always did, with a moment of silence for the fallen and a commitment to check on each other before the next gathering. But tonight felt different, marked by a sense of completion that had been missing since Max's death. As the veterans and their families filed out into the warm California evening, they passed beneath streetlights that illuminated the memorial statue in the town square. The bronze German shepherd seemed to watch over them with the eternal vigilance of a sentry who would never abandon his post. Sarah was the last to leave, pausing to place a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the memorial. In the 6 months since Max's death, she had thought often about the moment when he had chosen to shield the electrical junction with his own body, sacrificing himself to save others. It was the ultimate expression of the military working dog creed: loyalty above life, mission before self. "Thank you, soldier," she whispered to the bronze figure. Mission accomplished. The evening breeze rustled through the elm trees that lined Main Street, carrying with it the promise of another day in a town that had learned to honor its heroes, both human and canine, while they lived, and to never forget them after they were gone. In our golden years, we often feel forgotten by a world that values youth over wisdom, speed over experience. Max's story reminds us that true loyalty isn't measured by how we're treated, but by how we choose to love despite disappointment. Like Frank Patterson, many of us have faced dark nights of the soul, losing spouses, watching children move away, feeling discarded by systems we served faithfully. But Max showed us that redemption is always possible, that second chances exist for those brave enough to accept them. Whether you're a veteran who served overseas, a teacher who shaped young minds, or a parent who raised good children, your service matters. The loyalty you've shown throughout your life hasn't gone unnoticed. Sometimes the most profound healing comes when we stop waiting for recognition and start recognizing the worth in others and in ourselves. Your experience, your wisdom, your capacity for forgiveness are exactly what this world needs. Don't let anyone convince you that your best days are behind you. Questions for engagement. Have you ever experienced a moment when an animal showed you unconditional loyalty that changed your perspective on life? What lesson about forgiveness or second chances do you wish more people your age understood? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter and can inspire others who need to hear them.